Good morning. I'm Dave. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm glad we get to open the scriptures together today. You know, on a holiday weekend like this one, when a lot of our friends are traveling, it's a little less obvious. But usually, our church is so packed every Sunday that we are building a new facility to make room for everyone. You know, having so many people at church can be fun. So many potential friends. And yet it often doesn't work out that way. Many people are unpleasantly surprised to discover that even when surrounded by this large, friendly crowd, they still feel lonely somehow. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but odds are that many of you feel lonely. For years, we've been hearing about this epidemic of loneliness among older people, but recent studies have demonstrated that loneliness actually peaks at 2 points in life, around age 40 and then again at age 80. But the news gets worse. While loneliness peaks at these 2 points for every generation, researchers have discovered that with each succeeding generation, people report feeling more lonely than their predecessors did at that same age. So the average 15 or 20-year-old feels much lonelier than today's 40 and 80-year-olds did when they were 15 and 25, suggesting that 40 and 80 are going to be even worse for them. 22% of millennials claim that they have 0 friends. None. That's terrible. But Generation Z is even lonelier than those millennials. All this means that the loneliness you feel is not entirely your fault. It's a fundamental flaw in current American culture. Mother Teresa, who witnessed firsthand the devastation of poverty, claimed that loneliness is far worse. She lamented that in America, quote, "the biggest disease today is not leprosy or cancer, it's the feeling of being uncared for, unwanted, and alone." And we have it worse than almost any other place on earth. And this disease is killing us. In addition to rising rates of depression, addiction, and suicide, lonely people have a 26% higher risk of dying from high blood pressure and heart disease, because loneliness literally breaks our hearts. All of us know what it's like to feel lonely, which is strange, because as Americans have moved from rural farms into more urban areas, we're surrounded by more people than ever. We're constantly connected by Snapchat and Instagram and email and Twitter and cell phones. Our email boxes fill up faster than we can respond, and yet Americans are among the loneliest people on earth. One of my favorite bands growing up was The Police. They were a supergroup that sold out stadiums to adoring fans. So it's odd how many of their songs are about loneliness. And they soared to the top of the charts because those songs resonated with so many people. As Sting once sang, "It seems I'm not alone in being alone." He's not alone. People in every life stage today are lonely. Teenagers are surrounded by peers at school, and yet many of them feel desperately lonely. People in that stage of life can judge so harshly, and expectations and allegiances shift so frequently that it's impossible to know whom to trust. Often people who've just left college tell me they find relationships much more difficult now. They suspect it's probably some defect in Boston culture. But the reality is that relationships required time and effort in college, but we had so much time with people in such a similar life stage that only minimal effort or social skill was required to make these connections. After college, relationships still require time and effort, but we have less time together and even less in common as we pursue separate careers. So even more effort is needed. Those of you who are single, maybe unsure where you'll be invited for the big holidays or who will care for you when you're sick. So you assume that your burden is far worse than those who are married. But that may not be true. There's nothing more lonely than sleeping inches from someone with whom you still don't know how to connect? Young couples find that it's harder to muster the energy to go out on Friday nights to nurture other friendships because it's just so much easier to stay at home. So even if their marriage is going well, soon most couples begin to notice how lonely they are, though they aren't sure why, because they thought marriage was supposed to solve that. Having children makes relationships even more difficult because young parents lack the time and energy required to pursue friendships. Also, by that time, Americans have chosen to buy homes far from their friends so that at the very life stage, they have the least energy for overcoming relational obstacles. They've created more obstacles than ever. And as the children, parents gave up their parents and their friendships for, end up leaving them as adults to pursue their own lives. And then add in the effects of divorce or the death of friends or spouses, and many elders are isolated entirely. Every life stage is unique, but we all struggle with loneliness. This problem may be worsening, but it is not new. Many Bible characters also struggled with loneliness. King David once cried out to God, "Be gracious to me, for I am lonely." Kings, they're just like us. And this brings us back to the scripture passage that we read. This winter, we're in a sermon series learning how to be a church from the very first church in the Bible. And it seems like we have a lot to learn in this area because things just seem so different for them. We just read, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. It all sounds so joyful and relationally rich, not lonely at all, right? In their case, the church was even bigger. 3,000 strangers became Christians the very first day, and more were added every day after that. Talk about making it easy to get lost in the crowd, but somehow they experienced great relationships and abounding love despite all that chaos. So what are we missing? Many people come to church expecting us to solve their loneliness problem by giving them friends and a small group and someone to pray for them or visit them when they're sick. In very small churches, instead of hiring pastors who will lead them towards Jesus, often pastors are paid to be pretend friends, filling in the gaps left by the lack of actual family and friends. So they visit those who are lonely or sick, and they give you a ride to the airport when you're going somewhere. And when someone runs into financial hardship, they call the church office to bail them out because they don't have friends or family to do it. That's the model that many of us have gotten used to. But that is not the model we see in the original church. Instead, they created environments where people truly came to love each other and gladly cared for and shared with each other whenever there was a need. It was like a family. So why aren't we experiencing that kind of intimate fellowship that the early church did? Why don't some of us experience church to be a family? In the current issue of The Atlantic, conservative commentator David Brooks wrote a long piece with a title that I did not expect from a conservative commentator: Why the Nuclear Family Was a Mistake. We're going to post a link to that article on our website along with this sermon. But the gist of it is that while many of us, when many of us hear the phrase traditional family, we, from our pastors or politicians, talk about traditional families, often we have something in mind that is very untraditional. Most of us think a traditional family is a nuclear family, right? Mom, dad, 2.9 kids, and a dog. And that's God's design for the family that churches and governments are mandated to protect. But Brooks points out that this model really only dominated American culture from 1950 to 1965 and has been in steady decline ever since. Today, it mostly persists only among upper and upper middle classes. For most of history, humans have lived in much larger groups. Yes, there can be a mom, dad, and kids, usually far more than 2 or 3, as well as grandparents, uncles, aunts, adult children, and often even unrelated adults who've somehow been grafted into the family. Today, the average family or household in Gambia includes 13 people. Now, that is a traditional family. These large families often aligned with other large families to create a clan or tribe that all work together for the common good. A family like that is far more resilient than a nuclear family, because if one member gets sick or dies, there are others who can step in seamlessly to fill that person's role. So children experience far more stability. If someone loses a job, there are others who can pick up the slack so that person doesn't become homeless while waiting to find a new job. Older singles don't need to get married to have meaningful community because they can be part of the family without that. And young adults don't have to support themselves right away as they're starting a new career. Elderly members continue to have important roles in the family even after they've stopped contributing financially. Brooks points out that these arrangements are very durable and provided benefits for everyone involved. But those benefits came at a price. Everyone had to learn to tolerate people of different personalities and life stages. Today, we've mostly divided ourselves up into very narrow demographic categories because it's just easier for all of us. But isolating. I'm sure that rambunctious 8-year-olds were just as exhausting to the 80-year-olds back then as they can be today. But they all learned to put up with each other. Another cost of committing to family is that it limited your job options. If you wanted to move to a new city for a promotion, either the entire clan had to move with you, or you had to just settle for the best job that you could get nearby. This is the traditional family. But after many millennia of that, all this changed in the 1950s when the post-war economic boom brought young people off the farms and into the cities where they could make enough money to compensate for the lack of family nearby. Then, as today among affluent families, we can pay for the services that we used to rely on extended family or clan members for. While mom and dad are working, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and siblings used to take care of the kids. But now, we pay for daycare or nannies. Or one spouse earns enough that the other can stay home. Instead of turning to our elders for advice and encouragement, affluent families can pay for therapists and life coaches. Instead of relying on the group to take care of us when we're too old or sick to work, we hold on to our own money, and instead we buy insurance and we accumulate personal retirement accounts. But the sudden rise in income that made nuclear families possible for most Americans in the 1950s began to unravel by 1965. As real wages began falling through the 70s, most people couldn't afford the conveniences that make isolated nuclear families sustainable on their own. But somehow we still hold on to that ideal as if it were God's plan somehow. Another current in society that increased our loneliness was the increased emphasis on individual autonomy. People left family networks to move to wherever the best job was or their favorite weather. What people failed to account for was the increased social isolation this created. Into this lonely vacuum of relationships, a new cultural narrative formed that you needed to find your soulmate. That person who's going to satisfy all your emotional, spiritual, social, and sexual longings, but no one person can fulfill all of that. So today, the very institution of marriage is being crushed under the weight of these unrealistic expectations, as one person is expected to meet the needs that an entire community used to. So why do we live this way? Often our loneliness is the hidden cost of our other priorities. An extra degree, high prestige, travel every weekend, kids and a million activities, a large house, a job that pays more so we can get even a larger house. We don't account for the sacrifices relationships with God or other people require. But we expect them to just fit into the margins, which we've almost eliminated. I spoke to a former high rocker who moved away to pursue an impressive degree that he didn't need, and he left his close Christian friends and his girlfriend to do it. 8 months later, she dumped him, and he had no friends where he was living, and he felt estranged from God. He didn't realize how life-giving those relationships were until he gave them up for a less godly goal. All of this tells part of the story of how we got to be so lonely today. We've lost our clan relationships, our extended family relationships, and now even our marriage relationships. No wonder we feel so lonely. Almost all of you have experienced that. Elderly people feel it. Teenagers feel it. Married people feel it, and singles do too. At some point, nearly everyone struggles with loneliness today. We're rarely alone, but we're often lonely. Is there a better way? Is there any alternative way to live? Yes, I think there is, and we see it here in Acts 2. I want you to notice the rich layers of relationships in just this one verse. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. First, we see that these new Christians went to the temple every day. The temple was massive and had these huge courtyards in it where everybody would gather, and pretty much everybody in the city showed up for the 2 times of prayer each day at 9 and 3 p.m. And so this is not like going to a church service, right? It's a mob of many thousands milling about in the temple courts. It wasn't a place for intimate conversation, but everyone could greet each other and be reminded of their shared identity as God's people. But then we read that the Christians were together in that mob. They gathered, we're going to learn in chapter 5, at Solomon's colonnade, which was a specific place in the temple courts. Now, the group was still very large, but they had a special devotion to each other as followers of Jesus. Beyond those relationships, they broke down further into family-sized groups that met regularly in homes and ate together. And this is not a nuclear family size of a mom, dad, and 2.9 kids. In that culture, a home would have consisted of anywhere between 10 and 30 people, most biologically related, but not all. As new Christians were rejected by their biological families upon converting, they found new families within the church community. So these groups included people of every age and marital status who were committed to each other. Then a few verses later, we're introduced to the even tighter partnership between Peter and John. Now, this may seem like a trivial observation I'm making, but I actually think that it's one of the keys to unlocking this epidemic of loneliness in our churches and culture today. No one relationship holds the secret bullet to solving loneliness. It's the thoughtful layering of relationships that enables us to flourish. There's a guy who works at the gas station I go to named McClay. And we chat and we tell jokes. I enjoy seeing him because, we're friends. I mean, sort of. I mean, I don't know where he lives. He doesn't know about my dreams or my disappointments, nor I about his. But, we're not close, but no doubt about it. We are friends. Pastor Eugene and I, or my wife Michelle and I, are also friends. But I know them much better than I know McClay. They're the people that I've cried in front of and with whom I've shared my sins and all of my passwords. Somewhere between those two are a lot of you, whom I know very well and I love very much, but I don't know you as well as I know Eugene or my wife. All of these are friends. So obviously friendship is a lot more complex than we sometimes give it credit for. So relying on the work of Edward Hall, Joseph Myers, and M. Scott Peck, Today, I want to introduce you to a way of understanding relationships that may be richer than the way that we usually approach them. Because, as is often the case, modern science has arrived on the scene to discover what the ancients already knew. This slide depicts the socio-emotional walls that we build to protect ourselves from others, which psychologists sometimes refer to as ego boundaries. This illustration is intended to represent the various levels of intimacy in relationships, distinguishing how close or far from our hearts someone is. The various levels then get populated by people. Now, many people are on the outside, right? That's the biggest circle, and these are casual acquaintances. You have interaction with them, but the intimacy level is very low. Whenever I travel somewhere overseas and I see somebody with a Red Sox hat, I'm like, are you from Boston? Yeah, me too. Like, hey, suddenly, we don't even know each other's names, but all of a sudden we feel connected. The second tier represents the slightly smaller group whose names and personalities you do know, even if you don't know their deepest secrets. But you hang out, and you're glad when you see them. These are the people you might invite when you're going to a movie, or you're gonna throw a big party. The third layer includes your close friends. These are the people maybe that you live with or are in your small group. These are the people you know really well. They pray for you and you for them because you know each other's struggles and you love each other deeply. And then the fourth layer is the smallest circle, with only enough room for just maybe your best friend or your spouse or your mom. It's the person you trust the most, who knows your deepest secrets and your fears. Hall and Myers suggest that across cultures, people populate these circles in very similar proportions. So depending on the culture and personality, like introvert versus extrovert, there may be 1 or 2 people in the closest circle, 5 to 15 in the second, 25 to 120 in the third, and 125 or more in the outermost one. Sociologists refer to these levels respectively as intimate relationships, personal relationships, social relationships, and public relationships. And we see all of these in the life of Jesus. At times, he's surrounded by multitudes, numbering hundreds or thousands. Another time, he's teaching a tighter group of 72 disciples who became his primary ministry partners. Often, we encounter him with his 12 hand-picked disciples. And yet, within that close-knit group, he enjoys even deeper friendships with Peter and John. And then Jesus reminds us that there's a fifth circle that the sociologists surely sense, but don't know how to describe. This is the circle that even my spouse or closest friends will never penetrate. It's the deepest part of me that only God can access and understand. For this reason, we read that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Despite all of the crowds and close friends around him, Jesus also needed a private connection with God, just like we do. But God designed us to need other people also. So who are those people in the other 4 circles? Well, at times, Jesus calls these people friends. Other times, he calls them family. So which of the circles exactly represent your friends and your family? All of them. Here's the most interesting insight about all of this. If you have 1 or 2 of these circles full, maybe you have an amazing marriage and a ton of casual buddies, but you don't have that second tier filled with 5 to 15 close friends, you'll report feeling lonely on a survey. If any of the circles is underrepresented, regardless of which one, you'll experience that as loneliness, no matter how strong you are in all the other levels. The problem is that most of us are only good at populating 1 or 2 of these circles and relatively weaker in another. Maybe I'm great at making buddies. I'm the life of the party, but not good at intimate relationships. So I have no one in the inner circle. Conversely, maybe I have a best friend and we do everything together, but when I want to invite a bunch of people to a movie or over to my house to play games, I don't really have anyone to call because I don't have many social relationships. In either case, I'm going to experience that as loneliness, which other people won't understand. but you have tons of friends. You're the life of the party. But you have a great marriage. You can't be lonely. And yet, unless all of these circles are adequately filled, we are. But here's the insidious part. The way most people respond to that loneliness is by investing even more effort into developing the relationships on the level they're already good at. So I compensate for my lack of social friends by spending even more time with my spouse, because that's the relationship I'm skilled at, and then I can't figure out why I'm still so lonely. As you look at this graphic, in which levels are you relatively stronger? Which may be missing something? So where does the church come into all of this? Well, just being a Christian unites you with 2 billion of us around the world. So that is a form of public relationships. It's kind of like the ancient temple, provided. Denominations and church networks do the same thing. It gives me a sense of belonging to a community. It gives me a sense of identity in a larger world, which humans need. Interestingly, and not coincidentally, the average congregation in America is 79 people, meaning that most churches naturally meet our needs for social relationships. That's why they're that size. We hold potlucks, and we pass around each other's babies, and we joke and enjoy each other. And this is why most churches have intuited that they need to develop small groups, right? Tighter-knit subgroups of the church where people develop even more meaningful and vulnerable relationships, like those ancient gatherings in homes. Many people meet their spouse or best friend at church. We don't usually arrange that. Well, the Moonies do, but not many others. In any case, expecting the church to naturally fill our social circle can make things confusing when people come to a larger church like this one. There's no way that you're going to be able to fit this many people into your social circle. It's just too many. You're never going to get to know everyone. This is like the large crowds gathering in the temples that we read about earlier. It's valuable and enjoyable. It's not especially intimate. Sensing that something is missing in that large group, most Christians seek out a small group, but in doing that with strangers is just too big a jump in intimacy and commitment. So those rarely work out. We've all been in that small group where suddenly you're welcome. Hey, your name, welcome Dave. Well, we're just talking about our big sin this week. Why don't you share your big sin? It's too much, too fast. In larger churches, the better first step is to find a medium-sized group. And we've tried to make that easy by providing lots of on-ramps to many groups like that, including youth group and men's ministry and Moms Rock and Kids Rock and Anchor and family ministry and marriage ministry and young adult ministry and so many more. And from there, you can meet friends with whom you want to connect at a more personal level and form a small group. And along the way, you may even find a best friend or a spouse, which would be wonderful. This is what churches can do, just like happened in Acts. We can create a culture of generosity and love among strangers, and then set up programs where Christians can meet and make connections and learn to trust and depend on each other even more deeply. So our goal is not that you will stay in our programs forever, but that our programs can serve as petri dishes for spiritual friendships to form, at which point you won't really need the program anymore. In Psalm 68, God promises to set the lonely in families. And God did that by inviting us into his family, offering to adopt us as daughters and sons. And for this reason, Christians are called the family of believers. And for those who are lonely, this is a wonderful promise, but honestly, it is a strange sort of salvation because families can be a little strange. Help me out here. I just like you to raise your hand. Raise your hand if you have ever been in a family. If you've ever been in a family at any point in your life. Okay, almost all of you, a few of you clearly were just built in a lab, but all the rest. Okay, now, I want you to raise your hand again if your family ever had any just weird dynamics in it. That crazy aunt or an awkward relationship, some incompatible personalities, arguing, tension, or hurt feelings. Raise your hand if you've been in a family like that. Okay, if you're not raising your hand right now, I'm going to give you a little insight. That probably means you are that awkward person in your family. Because the reality is every family has some difficult dynamics. And maybe this is why God says the church is a family. Because it requires some hard work. We have this fantasy that other people's families are all lovey-dovey. But real families are complicated and messy and annoying at times and require lots of humility and forgiveness. So these relationships won't be easy just because they're with church people, right? We're sinful too. They're going to take effort, sacrifice, compromise. We're going to have to tolerate each other and trade some of our independence and preferences to find intimacy and commitment. In many cases, this is going to require some healing from a lot of us because many of us have patterns of brokenness or sin that prevent us from forming certain kinds of relationships. If you have a refrain about what's wrong with everybody else, it may be worth questioning whether the problem is really with them. This could be a wonderful thing to explore with the High Rock Guides or your small group or some friends. It may lead to some painful conversations and insights, but wounds from a friend can be trusted. If you've made some of these relationships a low priority over the years, you were chasing after a career, just concentrating on your own family, then there is no church program that can compensate for that. But if you want to pursue those relationships now, our church programs can give you a great place to do that. We want you to experience this church as a family, God's family, not the nuclear family ideal of two parents and a couple of kids isolated by themselves. This is a complex family that includes people of every age and life stage and income level and marital status and maturity level and personality. Some members we're going to know well and like immediately. Other members, not so much. But we're going to choose to love each other anyway because that's what families are like. My family has experienced that here. Over the years, we've made so many wonderful social friends who just make life more fun, as well as some closer personal friends through whom God shapes and encourages and challenges and supports us. And we them. Now, it takes effort and it required sacrifices to keep commitments, but it has been so worth it. Now, I have the largest nuclear family in the church, but even it isn't large enough on its own. Of course, kids do better with both biological parents, but they need more than that. Researchers say the thing teenagers need to retain their faith as they mature is not a killer youth group. It's a personal relationship with at least 5 Christian adults who are not their parents. Thanks be to God, my kids have found those people here and feel deeply loved by them. At High Rock, we want to create the kind of families where elders and singles and rich people and poor people and teenagers and people who wear ties and people with tattoos and everybody feels welcome and valued. We won't all know each other with equal intimacy, but we can build the many kinds of friendships that all of us need to flourish and find full life. So start by just saying hello to someone new today, someone you don't know, or invite someone into your home so that an acquaintance can become a friend. Try out one of our medium-sized groups. Even though you know it's going to be awkward making small talk with strangers, but that's how strangers can become friends. Help a friend in need, or risk asking for help from a friend, and that relationship might grow deeper. Include someone in your next big dinner or event that you might not normally think to. Families, consider if there are singles you could include. People who are established here. Consider if there may be internationals or new people you could invite over because they may not have many friends here yet and may be lonely. You could bless each other. And finally, remember that no matter how full your relational circles may become, you're still going to need Jesus at the center. No friend, no spouse, no one, and nothing can substitute for God. Jesus is the friend of sinners like you and me. And Jesus is the friend who will never forsake you and can lead you into intimacy with God and healthy relationships with his spiritual family, where you'll have sisters and brothers and uncles and aunts and children and parents and grandparents or grandchildren and friends that you had no idea you needed so much. Even though they still are going to require effort and hard work and healing and sacrifices, this opportunity for relationships can make churches very special places where we praise God and enjoy the favor of all the people. Let's pray together.